But we are in a series called I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, and we've said for the next several weeks we are putting the Bible aside as our source of authority, which is difficult for me as a Bible teacher, but we're trying to look at evidence that everyone can agree on, atheists and Christians alike, and we're looking at the evidence, and one of the things we've said is that all worldviews take faith, because all worldviews make truth claims that can't be proven with 100% certainty. God exists. God doesn't exist. Can't prove either of those with 100% certainty. God created the world in 7 days. All things came out of macroevolution from a single-cell organism. Neither of them can be proven with 100% certainty. Therefore, they require faith. But what we've seen is that when you have more evidence to support your truth claim, you need less faith. And when you have less evidence for your truth claim, you need more faith. And after the overwhelming evidence we saw last week, evidence from the Big Bang and from the way the universe has been fine-tuned to support life, we can know beyond a reasonable doubt we live in a theistic universe. God is. It takes a lot of faith to believe nothing made everything, because there's very little evidence for it, therefore it needs a lot of faith. We didn't use the Bible to come up with that conclusion, but science. Now, after last week's message, I got some questions emailed to me, which I really appreciated. I wanted to address a few of them. First of all, this is a question that came in. It says, if God really created the Big Bang, a lot of the Bible can't be taken at face value, creation in 7 days, etc. Great question, good point. But as I mentioned last week, I don't see the Big Bang and the creation account in Genesis 1 and 2 being in any kind of conflict, but they can both be accepted completely because I believe that while there's a high probability God used the Big Bang to create the universe we live in, all evidence is pointing that direction, that doesn't mean that God stopped his creation at the Big Bang. That there was matter that he created, energy, time, space that he created, and he continues to create. So let's say the Big Bang took place, who knows how long ago, 1 billion years ago, 10 billion, 20 billion years ago. We don't know. God's outside of time, doesn't matter to him. But he could then come to this rock created by the Big Bang called Earth, who knows how long ago, and then begin creating at a very different time. God didn't have to begin creating the Earth at the same time as the Big Bang is the point, and so it's not unreasonable to think that both are equally logical. Here's another question. If God created the Big Bang, the Earth is certainly billions of years old, kind of the same line of thought there, but is evolution therefore logical? Again, great question. I think I've already addressed the first part of it by saying, no, just because the Big Bang is billions of years old doesn't mean the Earth and the creation had to start billions of years old on our planet. But regarding the second part of the question, the logic of evolution, that's where we're intending to go today. You can just see how naturally one conversation flows into the next. Evolution, or where did life come from, or how did we get here? Where did life come from? How do we have such diversity and complexity of life? Genesis chapter 1 says it like this. Then God said, let us make man in our image, in our likeness. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female. He created them. Well, that's what the Bible says. But is there any evidence, any scientific evidence to support that? Was God involved in creation? Or is the diversity and complexity of life the product of random natural forces? Let me just tell you where I stand. I believe in 7 days of creation fairly recently. I believe this is compatible with scientific, with the Big Bang and everything else we're talking about. But the idea of evolution is one that gets people pretty fired up. It's been a debate for a long time. Charles Darwin, when he published his now famous book on the origin of species almost 200 years ago, called it a long argument. And the argument has been intensifying over the last 170 years, and it's been getting hotter and deeper. I mean, the battle has been set up as a battle of science versus faith, or facts versus religion. But what we see, a more accurate description of the battle, I think, is one between good science and bad science, and unreasonable faith versus reasonable faith. And you may be surprised to find out who is demonstrating bad science and exhibiting unreasonable faith. But let's begin by looking at Darwin's theory of evolution. that has been so widely accepted in our schools and universities. It's got a monopoly on the origins kind of concept. This is the only thing really being taught. But Darwin's theory of evolution, in a nutshell, is that all species have all descended from one common ancestor, that people and dogs and worms and birds all come from the same single-celled organism. The theory is that one type of creature can and has become another type of creature given a long period of time and slight modifications being made to that creature, so that a fish can become a lizard over a long period of time through slight modifications, that a lizard can become a bird given enough time and the right conditions. A bird can become a monkey can become a person. That all of this, given the right time and conditions, can eventually create a human being. And according to the theory, this is exactly what has happened. That the first single-cell organism went through enough time and made enough modifications that if the modification was beneficial to that single-cell organism, it had a better chance to survive. Therefore, it passed on that modification to the next generation. If it didn't have the modification, it wasn't strong enough to survive, it would not pass it on, what we know of as the survival of the fittest. And that single-cell organism passed on enough changes to the next generation to then become a multi-cell organism, and then enough time is given, enough modifications are given that improve the health and the survivability, viability of that creature. It eventually becomes a fish, that eventually becomes a lizard, and on and on. Enough modifications are made, and we get a human being, and that's where all life came from, and that's it, right? Darwin's theory explains where life came from, right? Not so fast. There is a glaring problem in this theory that is a huge problem for Darwinists, perhaps the greatest of all problems, and it's this one question: where did the first cell come from? This is a question that we have to get to, but that Darwin never even attempted an answer for. While the theory does its best to tell how we get diversity and complexity of life from the first simple cell life form, never even attempts to explain where that first single cell came from. Darwin's theory doesn't give any thought to where matter came from, where the universe came from, how the universe is so finely tuned as to be able to support life, nor where that first single-cell organism came from. Darwin just assumes all those things are there and then explains how more complex life forms could come from those pre-existing conditions and that pre-existing life. But where did it come from? How was that first single cell assembled? These are questions that demand an answer, and evolution does not offer answers to these questions. Maybe you've heard the joke that has circulated about the scientists who have advanced so far that they realize, you know what, we really don't need God anymore. So they elected one of the scientists to go and have a conversation with God and tell him, you know what, we don't need you anymore. And so the scientist goes and he talks to God and he says, you know what, we've come a long way. We're cloning people. We're doing miraculous things. We really don't need you anymore. So you can just kind of go off and mind your own business. And God listens to the scientist, and he says, okay, how about this? I challenge you to a people-making contest. Let's see who can make a human being. Scientist thinks about it and says, okay, we can handle that. You're on. And God says, we're going to do this old school, though. We're going to make a human being the way I made Adam. The scientist says, no problem. And he bends over and he picks up a pile of dirt, and God says, no. Go find your own dirt. You see the problem? We think we can take the building blocks of life and the things that God has already given us and put them together and say, oh, we've made life. But we're dependent on having those building blocks already created for us. You can't make a more complex life form before you have a single-celled organism. You can't have a single-celled organism before you have a finely tuned universe that can support life. You can't have a finely tuned universe before you have a universe. All of these things need to be in place. We have to look at life within the context of the larger picture. You can't create a single-cell organism without first creating the universe. But some will say, well, you know what? The building blocks of life were just there. They were just there, and they were attracted to each other, and they created the first life. That theory has been disproven. Others promote the theory of panspermia, which say, you know, well, here's how we got the first life. Aliens came, and they planted life. And this is, scientists are actually saying this, but you're like, really? Is that what we're coming to try to scratch God out of the equation? We still have to explain where the aliens came from, right? I mean, here's my point. Listen, rather than disprove the existence of God, Darwinian evolution is actually dependent on God to create the universe, to fine-tune the universe, and to create that first life, those building blocks of life that would create the first organism. But let's say that all those building blocks were just there, and somehow, some way, they were going to come together without intelligence and create the first cell. What are the chances that the first simple life form could just come together spontaneously without any kind of intelligent intervention? What is the probability? Well, the answer is, the probability is mind-boggling. The problem for Darwin and scientists in the 19th century is they had no concept of the complexity of the cell. They looked through the telescope, or the microscopes that they had at the time, and what they saw of the cell was just a blob of something, goo. They didn't know what it was. But since the 1950s, we have been able to get in the subcellular level. We're able to see what is happening inside of the cell, and it is a magnificent sight. Inside the cell, there are things happening. There are machines, actual machines working inside the cell that have specific purposes and jobs and duties, and they all work together. And all of this is happening inside of you billions of times a second. Just consider the complexity of the cell. Watch this short video.
With computer animation, we can enter the cell to view this remarkable system at work. After entering the heart of the cell, we see the tightly wound strands of DNA, storehouses for the instructions necessary to build every protein in an organism. In a process known as transcription, a molecular machine first unwinds a section of the DNA helix to expose the genetic instructions needed to assemble a specific protein molecule. Another machine then copies these instructions to form a molecule known as messenger RNA. When transcription is complete, the slender RNA strand carries the genetic information through the nuclear pore complex, the gatekeeper for traffic in and out of the cell nucleus. The messenger RNA strand is directed to a two-part molecular factory called a ribosome. After attaching itself securely, the process of translation begins. Inside the ribosome, a molecular assembly line builds a specifically sequenced chain of amino acids. These amino acids are transported from other parts of the cell and then linked into chains often hundreds of units long. Their sequential arrangement determines the type of protein manufactured. When the chain is finished, it is moved from the ribosome to a barrel-shaped machine that helps fold it into the precise shape critical to its function. After the chain is folded into a protein, it is then released and shepherded by another molecular machine to the exact location where it is needed.
This is absolutely mind-boggling to perceive at this scale of size such a finely tuned apparatus, a device that bears the marks of intelligent design and manufacture. And we have the details of an immensely complex molecular realm of genetic information processing. And it's exactly this new realm of molecular genetics where we see the most compelling evidence of design on the earth.
So all of what you just witnessed is taking place inside of one cell. And you have billions and billions of these cells in your body doing this all of the time. Incidentally, the man who just was speaking, Dr. Dean Kenyon, PhD, he actually in the late 60s, early 70s wrote the textbook trying to answer the question of where the origin of life came from. It was the textbook used in all the universities and schools called Chemical Predestination, in which he was the one with his partner that came up with the idea that life just was attracted to itself and it just happened. And he wrote the textbook. It was the textbook in the 70s. The more he studied, though, he realized this couldn't possibly happen. His theory was disproven. He has disavowed all of that and has become a believer in God and of an intelligent designer. Now, consider all of the information that is embedded in a cell. Like we just said, all of the RNA, the DNA, everything that is in the protein strand. Does this look familiar to you? Anybody like who's old as me? We used to use this before Google. It was called an encyclopedia set. This was the famous Encyclopedia Britannica 30-volume set, usually obsolete by the time it came off the presses, but it has a lot of information. You open up one of those volumes, just one page, it's got just thick with information. Well, staunch Darwinist Richard Dawkins of Oxford University admits that the information found just in the nucleus of a tiny simple-celled amoeba has all the information of those 30 encyclopedias contained in the nucleus. He says if you take the entire cell, that cell has the same amount of information as 1,000 sets of the 30-set encyclopedia. And this is coming from a Darwinist. He goes on to say that, well, let me just say, it has to be emphasized that every piece of information has to be strategically placed, just like a sentence needs to be formed right in the encyclopedia to make sense. The information in the cell has to be put in a logical order in order to make sense. It can't just all be thrown together. So what are the odds? Think about the simplest cell, the first life form that Darwin was trying to kind of start with. What are the chances, the probability it would just come together just by chance? When you consider all of the variables from the amount of amino acids available, how many amino acids are in a simple strand, say 200, and the specific order those amino acids need to come into altogether, the probability is really astronomical, more than we could really understand. It's been calculated doing the math at 1 chance in 10 to the 456th power. Now, as we said last week, statisticians would say anything over 10 to the 50th power would be statistically impossible or so improbable that it's so low it shouldn't even be mentioned in reasonable, rational conversation. But again, reasonable, rational people are saying life just happened to evolve. Those 200 amino acids came together in just the right order, just by chance. But again, look at the odds of this happening. Again, this is the chance of winning Powerball. 1 in 292 million. Now, those are pretty good odds as we start looking at the odds of other things happening. I mean, the probability of, or statistical impossibility is 1 chance in 10 to the 50th power. That's what that looks like. How many atoms are there in the entire known universe? Not just in our planet, not just in our solar system, not in our galaxy, but in the entire known universe. How many atoms there are? You've never seen an atom. They're so small. That's how many atoms there are. 10 to like the 72nd power atoms in our universe. Last week, we looked at a really mind-boggling number. What are the chances that life or the universe just fine-tuned itself with over 100 variables, constants, to be able to support life? We saw that was this number, 1 chance in 10 to the 138th power, that we would just by chance get a fine-tuned universe. What are the chances that first cell would come together just without any kind of intelligent intervention? I'm sorry, I had to change the font on this one. But it's 1 chance in 10 to the 456th power. That the first cell with all of those variables would just come together without any kind of intervention. It's like saying that those 1,000 sets of 30 encyclopedias came about because a printing press that had a lot of letters in it exploded. And all of those 1,000 sets of 30 encyclopedias just came to be. What are the chances of that? Like that. But then you have to explain, where did the printing press come from and who created the letters? Microbiologist. And let me just say, all this is before we even get to the problem of evolution. This is just dealing with the first life, the first cell. Microbiologist and atheist Michael Denton wrote a book. It was called Evolution, a Theory in Crisis. He said the complexity of the simplest known type of cell is so great that it is impossible to accept, this from an atheist, Impossible to accept that such an object could have been thrown together suddenly by some kind of freakish, vastly improbable event. Such an occurrence would be indistinguishable from a miracle. That's why I don't have enough faith to be a Darwinist. But let's suppose that it did happen. Let's suppose somehow, some way, all the parts of life were there. Somehow nothing created something. And that something was somehow brought together to form the first life. How then did that life evolve into what we now have as this incredibly diverse, incredibly complex ecosystem with all the organisms? How do we now have elephants and whales and anteaters? How do we have viruses and bacteria and bugs? I mean, how do we come up with the magnificent human brain that's able to kind of calculate everything I'm saying right now and kind of process it based on all of your experience? How do we get that? According to Darwin, it evolved through a series of minor modifications over a long period of time. Now, one important differentiation we need to make at this point as we talk about evolution, it's very important that we differentiate these 2 points. And that is the difference between microevolution and macroevolution. Adaptation, evolution, microevolution, macroevolution. Microevolution describes slight modifications to a species within a species. That can happen over time. This is what sparked the idea of evolution for Darwin. He was on the Galapagos Islands. He sees the finches with all the different kinds of beaks. Some have small beaks that give it advantage in certain kinds of seeds. Others have long, hard beaks, gives it advantage in other kinds. And what he realized that over time and with certain conditions, whether drought or rainy season, that different finches with certain sized beaks can pass on their beak with the advantage to different generations and over time change the finch population. Microevolution. He rightly deduced that different conditions on the island can change the finches and pass those advantages on to following generations. Modification within a species. Is there evidence for microevolution in nature? Of course. We see it all the time. We actually take part in it. Dog breeders take different kinds of dogs and breed them together, and that's why we have cockadoodles and, yeah, you know what I'm talking about. Different kinds of dogs. We do it with cows. There's different breeds of cows. We breed cows together, get different breeds of cows. We take the advantage of this cow, that cow, put them together, we get a new breed of cow. But here's the thing. As much as we have worked with breeding dogs, we have never been able to breed two kinds of dogs and come up with a cow. Or two kinds of dogs and come up with a cat. Dogs always stay dogs. Cats always stay cats. Cows always stay cows. And that's macroevolution, the belief that enough changes in a species will create a new species. That enough minor modifications in a fish will eventually lead that fish to become a lizard. That enough minor modifications in a lizard will eventually lead it to become a bird. That's the difference between microevolution, changes within a species, which we can all witness, and macroevolution, changes from one species into another. Does the fact that there is evidence for microevolution mean that macroevolution is also true? This is what Darwin propositioned. This is what Darwinists want people to believe, that because there is one, there must be the other, but it is absolutely not true, because there is no evidence for macroevolution. That there would be enough variations to create new species. It's never been observed. We've never been able to do it, even with intelligent intervention. In addition, there is little to no evidence that it's ever happened. First, there has never been an intermediary life form discovered. Where is the evidence for the half lizard that became also the half bird? If Darwin's theory was right, there would have been a long period of time that the lizard bird lived on the planet, and we would be able to find some evidence for the lizard bird, but there's no evidence for it or any other intermediary life forms. And more than that, it would be impossible for those intermediary life forms to exist. Think about this. A lizard has advantages because it has scales. A bird has advantages because it has wings and feathers. But an intermediary life form with no scales and no fully formed wings or feathers has no advantage. Therefore, according to the survival of the fittest, that species would not survive over this long period of time that it would need to go through the adaptations to become a new species. Therefore, well, let me just add to that there is also no evidence in the fossil record for macroevolution. If macroevolution is true, one might suspect that the evolutionists' greatest ally would be the fossil record, that we can go there and we can see between all the different layers of fossils, that we would see these intermediary life forms as these life forms were changing and adapting. Instead, we see a completely different picture in the fossil record. For instance, consider what's commonly called the Cambrian explosion. It's one layer in the fossil record where it seems that all body parts and all life forms came about as is, intact, in one time period in history. Again, Richard Dawkins, the evolutionist and Darwinist, has said it like this. He writes, "It is as though they were just planted there," speaking of the Cambrian explosion, "without any evolutionary history." Darwin himself looked at the Cambrian explosion and the fossil record itself, and Darwin has said, nature may almost be said to have guarded against the frequent discovery of her transitional or linking forms. In other words, there's no evidence for these intermediary life forms. He had hoped that later, after his life, those things would be found. That was his confidence. They would eventually be found. We're still looking. But there isn't only a lack of evidence for evolution, but there is great reason and sound logic against evolution. It's compelling. Consider just one such compelling piece of evidence against evolution, and it's the problem, we've talked about it before, irreducible complexity. This is an idea that was brought out by biophysicist Michael Behe in his very good book, Darwin's Black Box. And the idea is that evolution, with its gradual incremental changes over vast periods of time, have no explanation for how a highly complex system or machine could evolve through kind of gradual systematic changes when you need all of the parts of that complex system in order for it to work. Think of a car engine. A car engine has lots of different parts that all need to be working for the car to move. You cannot have a car evolve through different parts because it doesn't work until all of the pieces are there. Darwin wrote in Origin of Species, again, he says, "If it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down." Now, he clarified that by saying, "I could find no such case. I can't find those complex organisms." Well, Michael Behe, in his book, Darwin's Black Box, lists no less than 5 highly complex systems that could not possibly have evolved through minor modifications because all of the system needs to be intact in order for it to work. Consider one of the most simple examples, the eye. You know, the eye is made up of 50-some different parts in order to function. All those parts are needed. You take one of those parts out, the eye no longer works. Well, the assumption with Darwinism is that everything started with a single-cell organism, and eventually the eye must have evolved somehow, some way. And so the idea is that, well, maybe one organism got a kind of little flap over itself that could detect light, or, you know, and then something else was added to it, until finally we get an eye. Well, according to survival of the fittest, if that modification doesn't benefit the species, it would not be passed on to the next generation. What use is 2 parts of an eye, 5 parts of an eye, 50% of an eye, 95% of an eye? There's no use to it whatsoever. It doesn't work. Therefore, how do you get 50 modifications with no use whatsoever to the species that eventually becomes an eye? It is, according to Darwin, impossible. His theory breaks down because of irreducible complexity. The eye, blood clotting. Millions of things have to happen for you not to bleed out every time your blood clots. There's so many systems within our bodies that are irreducibly complex. Little cells have been found with outboard motors that have 26 different parts that all have to be put together in precisely the right order. All 26 parts need to be there in order for the cell to work. If the 26 parts aren't there, one part's missing, it doesn't work. If they're put together in the wrong order, it doesn't work. It is put together by design. Back to the eye, Darwin said this. He said, "To suppose that the eye with so many parts all working together could have been formed by natural selection seems, I freely confess, absurd." So, a little bit of evidence. But the question begs to be asked, with all this evidence, how or why would anyone continue to believe in evolution? Really smart people with like PhD at the end of their names, why continue to promote Darwinism, have so much faith in this theory? Well, I think we have to understand that what we're talking about here isn't just an intellectual, objective conversation. Scientists aren't taking an objective, dispassionate look at the evidence and just coming up with the theory of evolution or Darwinism. Think about this. Again, Darwinist Richard Dawkins is famous for this quote. He says, "It is absolutely safe to say that if you meet someone who claims not to believe in evolution, that person is ignorant, stupid, or insane, or wicked, but I'd rather not consider that." Why is he so mean? Why the vectives? Why is he so emotional? Objective scientists in their white lab coats, they're not supposed to be so emotional. They're not supposed to be so mean-spirited. They're supposed to be objective. There must be something else at stake here for people to become so emotional about this topic. And as we dig beneath the surface of Darwinism, we find there definitely is an agenda to keep this as the monopoly on the conversation of origins and to keep any opposition to this conversation silent. Science is intended to be the search for causes, for answers. And I believe it is faulty science to come at any evidence having already ruled out half of the possible answers that there could possibly be intelligence or divine direction in creation. I mean, how can you look objectively at evidence for the origin of life when you rule out the possibility for intelligent design or an existence of God or divine cause before you even start? That's not science. That's having an agenda. And scientists have had their judgment clouded by their ideology that there can be no God. They begin looking at the evidence with the idea there can be no God. And the funny thing is, this is exactly what evolutionists have been accusing creationists of, saying creationists are clouded, our view is clouded because of our religious bias and ideology, that creationists refuse to look at the facts and look at the science. But I believe a creationist looks at it and says, we're willing to consider God and we're willing to consider natural causes. Everything is open. We're just looking at the evidence and following it to the logical conclusions that they lead us to. Quick word on theistic evolution. The idea that God guided evolution over eons of time. Let me just say, if you want to believe that, go ahead and believe that. But why believe that when there's no evidence for it? We're not finding any evidence for intermediary species. We're not seeing that. So why do we need to believe that God would have had to use death in order to create life? A lot of people believe it. I don't believe it. But you look at the evidence and go where the evidence leads you. In the end, there are really only two possibilities. Either God created us or we created God. Right? That's it. Either God really exists or he's just a creation of our own minds. But according to the overwhelming evidence, God created our amazing minds as well as all life that we see. You've got to have a lot of faith to believe that without God or any intelligent intervention whatsoever, the universe came into being out of nothing. And nothing created everything. You have to have a lot of faith to believe also that the universe was fine-tuned for life in 1 chance in 10 to the 138th power. You have to have a lot of faith to believe that the first cell generated spontaneously in 1 chance in 10 to the 456th power. And you have to have a lot of faith to believe that all life, the complexity of life, the diversity of life, all came from that one cell when there is little to no evidence that there is any kind of example of any intermediary forms to support Darwin's theory. It takes a lot of faith. The origin of life has to be seen in this broader context that we've previously covered. We've demonstrated beyond a reasonable doubt that this is a theistic universe. There is a God. Not only did he create the universe from outside of time, outside of space, outside of matter, not only did he fine-tune the universe in his supreme intelligence to be able to support life, but he also created life. All life. In all its variety, in all its complexity, all the evidence points to this reality, and that's why I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. Would you just stand with me as we pray together? Thanks for joining us today. Father, all I can say is thank you that I'm here, that we're here, that you've created everything that is, and you've left evidence. You've left your mark on it. Thank you for the brilliant minds you've given us to be able to reason these things out, to look at the evidence and not only come to the reality that you are, but what you're like. And God, I know that in this room, we are at all different places in our relationship with you, our knowledge of you, our acceptance of you. For those of us who have already placed our faith in you and the evidence you've given us, bolster our faith, God. May we just have a greater appreciation for who you are. And for those of us who are really grappling with whether you exist or not, may the evidence that has been presented this morning, evidence that we search out on our own, may it all lead back to this one reality. You are, and you are God, and you are good. And I just ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen.